Welcome to the Unscripted Authentic Leadership Podcast, a podcast where we're seeking to lead change while also seeking to understand. We're also here as a platform for leaders to come together to unite, to develop, and empower other leaders in the areas of business, family, and community. I'm your host, Lafayette Lang, joined by my co-host, John LeBron, and today we are joined by our special guest, Dr. Dee Knight, who has joined us to have a conversation on how to work through trauma to become a better leader. Dr. Knight is a licensed clinical psychologist. She's a wife and mother who is passionate about seeing brokenness restored. She's also an author and international speaker who loves teaching others about their minds, bodies, and pathways to live wholeheartedly. Today, she has joined us right here on the Unscripted Authentic Leadership Podcast. Dr. Knight, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. Very happy to be here.
Absolutely. So we're talking about how to work through trauma to become a better leader. I want to talk about your passion for restoring brokenness. I think that is a beautiful and an awesome thing to have a passion of restoration. Where did that passion for seeing broken things being restored come from?
I think it came from my own life. And so I think that the path that I took, even for education, was probably somewhere a subconscious search and quest for my own healing. I started off as a nursing major, and I was really into ER back then. I don't know if you guys are familiar with ER, but
Oh yeah.
ER was pretty big. And so I was like, okay, nursing, cool. And then I was just like, oh no, someone's going to ask me to hand me something stat or hand them something stat, and someone will die from this because I will just be like, what? And so it's like maybe not nursing, maybe not my thing. And then I went into English, and this is just the reason that I even get into this is because oftentimes people wonder, how do I even know how to find my passion, right? How do I know what thing is my thing? Try different things, right? So I sometimes tell people, don't do what I did, which was bounce around from one thing to the next. But then I say, but do what I did, right? You need to experience lots of different things. And so I experienced lots of different things because I was an English major, English composition. I loved poetry. Then I was like, okay, only so much Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I can only take so much of this. What else am I doing that I'm excelling at, but not putting forth like the most effort in the world? It was psychology. It just came naturally to me. I enjoyed it. I was kind of skipping class, but still making an A. And so I was just like, that seems like something that's relatively easy for me. And true enough, the things that we tend to enjoy and the things that we are passionate about oftentimes they're things that come relatively easy for us, and they're things that we kind of smoothly go into, and it can go very smoothly for us because that's the thing that we're supposed to be doing. That's the thing that we're called to. So that's what I did. I realized I couldn't do very much with my bachelor's degree, got my master's degree, and somewhere in my master's degree I fell in love with psychology and decided I wanted to get my doctorate. That's how I got where I am.
Wow. So someone who specializes then in trauma and things like that, and I know we're going to kind of get into it deeper, but we'll start light. What constitutes as a trauma? And I know that sounds silly, but I think it's important to understand because I think some of us, it's kind of like PTSD, where some people think it's only if you've been in a war and through an explosion, versus other realize there's many domestic things that could happen that could cause a PTSD. So what PTSD? So what would constitute as a trauma, like at the basic level?
Yeah, and so we could always go by the standard definition, right? Which is something that is deeply distressing or disturbing in some way. That would be something that is traumatic. It's subjective. We get to decide whether or not something was traumatic for us. And it's not just that we get to decide it. For some people, the same incident might be traumatic, and for some people, it might not be. They might not experience something that another person experiences as traumatic. You might not experience it as traumatic, right? So it is subjective to some degree. I would define a trauma as any situation where there is not an immediate or an effective dose of healing for the amount of harm that is done, right? So, an example of something physical, I think physical can sometimes be, the physical examples can sometimes be a little more clear than the psychological examples. So, just as a physical example, when you prick your finger for testing your blood sugar or your iron levels, that is a trauma. You are bursting your blood vessels, your skin, you're getting down into your flesh, right? You bleed some. It causes a little bit of pain. That is a small trauma, though. It is something that is generally there's a, an equal amount of healing that's pretty immediate. You don't bleed all night or the next day or days later, your finger is hurting you, right? Generally, the trauma has the healing available to it. What about when you harm yourself in a larger way, right? So I got this little cutting thing, some little kitchen tool during this pandemic where I thought I was going to be cooking more than I was. When I used this tool, I wasn't used to using it. I slapped it down into place and my finger overshot and slapped directly on the blade. Cut my finger open. I literally could see my bone on the inside. That is a much larger trauma. It took weeks to heal. It still has a little bit of what I probably I'm diagnosing myself with some post-traumatic arthritis because that does exist and it's stiff and it cracks and it makes noises and it doesn't close as well when I'm trying to open a vacuum sealed jar, right? So there is something that happened there that is different from a pinprick. Pinpricks hurt. And if I had a lot of pinpricks, guess what? That would also be traumatic. But the pinprick and the slapping your hand down on a blade, very different things, right? Requires a different amount of healing, a different length of time for healing. The healing was not immediately available. I experienced a trauma right to my hand. Same thing for when we're talking about traumatic things that people experience, like from childhood or from assault or from car accidents. I could be in a car accident and not feel traumatized by it. Someone else might be in that same car accident and they had a different vantage point, a different perspective. And perspective is so, so very important. It really does matter what vantage point we're at. And in fact, I was just looking at something the other day. I'll be quiet after this so you can ask your other questions. But I was looking up how do you tell the difference between a sunset and a sunrise, like when you're looking at pictures. So I was just thinking there has to be a different way, and there is no way. There's no way. You know why? Because the sunset and the sunrise are the same thing. We're just at different vantage points. So the sun is rising for somebody else while it's setting for someone else, right? There is no difference. So sometimes the same event might have a different vantage point, but it has a totally different meaning for the person, right? For somebody, it's becoming daytime. For someone else, it's becoming night. And so those are my explanations, at least for now, about trauma.
My goodness. That was so good because as John said, I think we generalize that word trauma and you just gave a really good spectrum of what it could be, from the least to the greatest. But how do you help someone communicate working through their trauma? Like how do you get someone to admit, okay, hey, this is something that you need to work through, and how do we work through that through our communication?
I love that you went to communication. Communication is so important. So I'm glad that you went to communication as far as how we work through trauma. And I'm also glad that you used the words worked through and not necessarily get over. So often we talk about getting over our past or getting past our trauma. And I think we have to redefine those things sometimes because the reality is we are always healing. I was in a yoga class once, and the yoga teacher was just saying, and that's fine. You might feel yourself stretching and moving, and you feel some things falling into place, and that's okay because our bodies are always healing. And I was like, lady, could you stop with the therapy session? We're trying to exercise here, but it is so true that we are always working towards healing. The only thing that is not either healing or dying is something that's stagnant, right? So we are always moving towards one of those things, and sometimes both of those things. As we travel in time, we're moving towards our own mortality, right? But the reality is, we have to use language sometimes to figure out. And for people who don't have language, there's still some communication of the experiences we're having, right? That is exactly how we navigate trauma. We start with some of the language that we have around it. And not everyone is willing to admit a trauma that they've experienced. I In my weird life, I sometimes run into people in the grocery store that I do not know, okay? Who will explain some of the traumas they've experienced. One time I was going through the checkout line and I just asked the girl, how are you doing? And she said, oh, not so well right now. I just had a loss in my family. And part of my mind was like, girl, You're supposed to say fine and check out my groceries. What are you doing? Stop. You're messing up the social norms that we have, right? But I love those experiences because it really trains us to be authentic with the language that we use. If I'm going to ask someone, how are you doing? I had better be ready for how they're doing, right? If I'm going to ask someone, like, how's your day going today? I had better be ready for how their day is going today. And that's how we work through trauma is through our language, through being able to express what it is we're experiencing. And even if the person is not willing to admit at that time that it's a trauma, right, that they've experienced, which I've had some people who don't admit that they've experienced a trauma. Sometimes I want to know, what would you say about a friend who told you this story that you just told me, right? What would you define it as? Because a lot of times we have more compassion for other people than we have for ourselves. And that is disastrous when you're talking about long term effects, right? You have more compassion for someone else's story and not your own, or you think someone else's story is worthy of care and compassion, but not your own. And it's really important that we start using language to explain our situations and describe our situations in ways that make sense for our story. And it's not always what I think about your story, right? Sometimes it's what do you think about your story? And that's really the most important thing.
All right, so you're talking about then using your story.
Mhm.
I find that I guess I would almost split it into a couple groups. Some people want to not discuss their situation. I used to work with a lady named Jeanette, and she's open. Shout out to Jeanette Campbell. And she had I don't know if she listens, but she had a daughter. When we worked together, her daughter had already passed away. And she talks about this openly and not sharing a secret. And this is probably 10 to 15 years ago when I found out about this. So we're talking or just hanging out working. And one day she starts talking about how her daughter was murdered by her ex-husband. And I was like, whoa, like I felt like she just laid a bomb on my shoulder. I had no idea what to do in that moment. And she's like, yeah. But she was talking about it so freely. And then it was probably within the last 5 to 8 to 10 years before that. I don't really know. I guess 5 or 6 years before we had met. And she had a new daughter who was about 2, and she was newly married. So it was probably 8, 10 years. But she's like, yeah, she would just talk about my husband had, yeah, basically I came home and killed her daughter. And I don't remember he committed suicide or not, but I don't know why he did it. But talk about a traumatic event. But basically her therapist who had helping her over time was talking about how she should feel comfortable talking about the situation. And she really did. It wasn't like she was talking about it in a sort of suffering or sobbing sort of manner. It was just kind of like sharing her story openly and freely as if somebody would from a stage. And it's the first time I had heard somebody so comfortably share something that dramatic and feel so strong at the same time. Like it wasn't as if they were trying to confess something. It was just a natural conversation. And I found out later that she was told you should talk about these things. And she'd been doing it for several years. It seemed healing. And so I've also noticed then that there's people who take their traumas and use it for sort of a big stage to help other people. So can you talk to that? As you're talking about sharing your story, is this a form of therapy? And is it solely just to help other people, or what's the benefits of this?
So let me ask you just really quickly to clarify. You said it seemed healing. Are you saying it seemed healing for you to hear her discuss it in that way, or seemed healing for her as she was discussing it? Wasn't
It
sure what you said.
seemed healing for her. For
Okay.
me, it was a surprise. I thought, oh my goodness, did you mean to say that? Was that an accident? What do I do now?
Mm-hmm.
Do I
Mm-hmm.
change the conversation? Do I engage in the I had no idea. And I don't remember I did. I remember I think I just sat there and listened and let her talk because I didn't know what to do. But it was just like, oh, what did you just say? And then I thought, is she like making up a story? Is this true? And it was a true story,
Mm-hmm.
but to her it was healing. But I've just noticed that sometimes you'll go to an event and somebody will be speaking from stage about something just as traumatic and how they overcame it. And it seems almost like overcoming and then sharing with an audience is their way of healing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. Thank you for clarifying. So, a few things. First, you said 8 to 10 years had passed. I am not a believer in time healing all wounds. I am not. I don't think there's any merit to that. But as time goes on, sometimes we can do healing things, right? So, you talked about her going to therapy. So, I know that she was working on some type of healing throughout that time. And you said that you ended up finding out that her therapist told her just talk about these things, right? I think that that is very powerful. Now, one thing that might pop in people's mind, something that I've heard lately is this, this idea of trauma dumping, which can sometimes be used to control other people or a situation or an outcome. Or perhaps some people describe it as when you discuss something traumatic without giving people the option of opting out of the conversation. And that can cause some kind of secondary trauma for people sometimes, but not always. And it sounds like she said it in a way that you were uncomfortable, but not necessarily traumatized, right? And so that's the reality of living life on planet Earth with other people. Some things are uncomfortable, right? And if we are to be people who are loving and kind and compassionate and supportive of others. I think it was, oh goodness, I forgot her name, Buddhist monk. She was talking about the fact that in order to really be healing of people's traumas and to really meet people where they are, we have to develop the capacity for recognizing, number one, that there is evil in this world, that it happens to other people, right? And we have to develop a capacity for hearing people's stories. And that means that sometimes, and it doesn't mean you have to sit there and listen to the details of things. In fact, I had a friend who messaged me today who said, I'm not sure if you have the space to deal with mom issues, but let me know, right? She said that before dumping on my lap what was going on with her, right? And so I appreciate that. She didn't have to do that, but that's just respecting the relationship, right? And that's not to say that Jeanette wasn't respecting the relationship, by the way. Let me just be really clear about that. Jeanette was being a human being, and I
Yeah,
love
she was
that for
fine.
Jeanette. Jeanette was being a human being dealing with the situations and the realities of her life, and she trusted you enough to share that with you.
Mhm.
And I think that sometimes we have to look at that as a space of, wow, I don't know what to say, but this person entrusted this with me. And like, that's a better response, right? Then, oh, this is kind of weird. Jeanette, could you not talk about that? No, no, no. Recognize that this person has entrusted you with whatever it is they're sharing. And we have to develop that capacity to be able to listen to people's stories. And yeah, sometimes you go to an event and someone's sharing from a stage. And I always recommend that people don't do it for the purpose of healing. But the byproduct is definitely that it's healing, right? And when I say don't do it for the purpose of healing, I mean don't go to an event and go to speak to a group of people. And I'm saying this specifically, especially because this is a leadership podcast. So we have people who are leaders who've experienced trauma. And I want people to be able to steward their stories well and steward other people's stories really well, also, right? So don't go to an event expecting someone's response to be healing for you, expecting someone to say, wow, that was a really good story. Thank you for sharing that. Can't do it for the applause. Do it for yourself. Do it because it's something that's healing for you just to be able to share, but not because of the reaction that you want from other people. Because guess what? Some people ain't going to care about your story. Some people will not care that you were healed. Some people will not care that you were delivered. Some people will not care that your life was saved and you almost lost it. Some people really won't care. They're going to chew their bubble gum and go on and move on with their life, right? That's okay. You have to be sharing your story for you, for the purpose of, I want to share this, or I'm at a space where I'm ready to share this. And that way you're not hinging your healing on someone else's reactions or someone else's response to what it is you shared. So good for Jeanette. Sounds wonderful, to be honest.
Dr. Knight, I recently finished a book entitled Cry Like a Man
Mm,
by Jason Wilson. And he's an African American brother that wrote the book. And he was basically talking about his experiences growing up, abusive father, neighborhood that he went through, and how he had to learn how to cry like a man. What do
mm.
you say to those people, specifically men? Because and maybe you can, speak to that even more than I can because you're the psychologist. I'm not. It seems like we struggle more with our emotions, expressing it, and we want to heal. It's not that we don't want to heal through the trauma. We don't know how to effectively handle our emotions because we don't want to quote unquote look weak, or we don't want to look like we're, not the masculine, the GI Joe per se. What do you say to those that may come to you in therapy or ask you, how do I deal with this without looking weak or coming off like I can't express my emotions or I can't cry like a man?
Yeah, that sounds like I wrote that down. That sounds like a wonderful book. But our tears, and we have scientific research on this, right? Our tears are helpful for us. We have them for a reason. I mean, tears literally help us see more clearly, right? They kill bacteria, they help refresh the eyes, they remove toxins from your eyes, and they also can help elevate your mood, right? When we're talking about crying, that emotional expression allows you to have an elevated mood. And sometimes your body is just looking for that cathartic experience, right? Just catharsis alone is not going to be the most or the only healing thing in your life. But you have to allow yourself those emotional expressions, right? And it's very difficult to unsocialize someone. I think it can take a lifetime to get socialized one way. It can take the rest of your lifetime unsocializing, right? Or untangling some of those things that we've been taught. Like, when you hear someone tell a kid, oh, you're a big boy, don't cry, you'll be okay. We have to start changing that messaging. We really need a paradigm shift. But for those of us who grew up in that era of, oh, you're a big boy or you're a big girl, don't cry, and we got those messages really ingrained into us, we have to be intentional about unlearning those things. And it's a choice. It is a day by day choice whether or not I'm going to choose unlearning some of the unhelpful things that I was given, right? I often think about how our view of the world is kind of like a garden that we're tending, right? And sometimes you get the garden and it's already got some seeds sown in there. It's already got some weeds that you have to pull out of the garden. And that's what we're doing when we're choosing to unlearn some things. We have to choose to pull up some weeds. And we can sit there and say, oh, well, these are the weeds that I was given, and this is just what I have to deal with. Or we can get to work. We can get to work, and it really takes intentionality. So there's not any trick or any gimmick. It's a choice. It's a choice to decide what I think is best for me and whether or not I think, no, I'm just going to bottle up my emotions and hold them down, which some people have told me before. They'll tell me with words, right? No, I'm just bottling that up. Okay, like you get to choose that. My job is not to convince anyone that what they're doing is not the right way of doing it, right? And I also don't like to take people's resources from them. If you're doing it a way that I think is not maybe the best way to do it, bottling it up and holding in your emotions, which research tells us that is not the best way to do things, right? It's not the best way to navigate life. You're increasing your chances for heart disease and increasing your chances for stroke and cardiovascular cerebrovascular disease, right? You're increasing all of these negative things in your life when you bottle things up, as opposed to using language to be able to share them and using your tears, using your emotional expressions, right? But if you choose to do that and that's what's working for you, I leave people. I think that Dr. Phil asked a wonderful question, which is, how's that working for you? If it's working for you, by all means, continue. If it's not working for you, and sometimes the sign that it's not working for you is that you have a lot of turnover in your organization, right? A lot of people come to work for you, but then they realize, "Oh, you're not the best person to work for," right? If you have a lot of dissent within your ranks, right? So there's a lot of backbiting and going around the next in line and maybe talking behind people's back and right. See what culture you're creating with what do you think is working for you, right? Is it working for you? So I ask that quite often because I want to know if it's working for you. I don't want to take it from you, right? But if you think that you might need to have just a few changes, perhaps. Let's start making some of those changes. And how do we start doing it? I'm going to sound like a broken record, but therapy. Go to therapy. Talk to someone else who can give you a good perspective on what your experiences are based on how you lay it out for them, right?
So then I wonder, because I would say I've been navigating this myself a little bit. There might be some ways that are healthier to express those emotions to get, I say for trauma, but it could be for stress. It could be for simply some really bad news, anything that's upsetting. So for example, there was a young man who's I coach, and I hadn't seen him in a couple months. And this past season when I was coaching him, he had He reminds me of my son because he's one of the smallest kids on our lacrosse team. And he would come to practice and games and he'd be in pain, but he didn't know why his hips were hurting and things like that. He would play through it. I'm like, you need a break? No, I'm good. Just tough as heck. And then he would be out for a week or two because he's at the doctor getting tests run. They can't figure out why his body's in so much pain, just in different spots with no reason. They think he could be overworked, different things. Fast forward, he comes back in this season. He's playing in tournaments. You can tell he doesn't feel good, but he doesn't want to be away from the team. Just incredible heart for this young man. And then about 2 weeks ago, I get a text saying he was diagnosed with leukemia. And now he's in the hospital and his organs are starting to fail. And I was just like, oh my goodness. Like, I remember sitting there and I don't want to talk about it. My wife wants to ask about questions. And I'm thinking, I don't really want to discuss it right now. And I remember as you're talking about this, I remember I didn't think of it this way at the time, but trying to figure out the best way to manage the emotions of it. He's not my child, but I know him relatively well from spending so many hours. And not just that, but the instant reflection of his pain that he was in that we didn't know why, but he kept fighting through it and playing through it because all he wanted to do was be with his teammates. And then so then I just find myself like wanting to be emotional as far as like not even just all out cry, but like sort of well up. And then you're like, well, maybe I need to go for a walk. Well, maybe I need to go just sit in the room. Maybe I need to go run. Maybe I should go punch the punching bag in my basement. All the things. And then it just later on I started thinking, I wonder what the most healthiest way is for is there a genuinely healthier way to deal with these types of things versus others?
Oh my goodness, you just hit on so many things. I'm going to try to
That's
get
totally
to a
authentic.
few
That
of
was
them.
2 weeks ago, everybody.
Okay, so I'm going to try to get to a few of the things that you just mentioned. You mentioned so many great things. So first of all, yes, physical activity is, I just saw someone posting about SSRIs. That's the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. It's a common prescription for as far as an antidepressant, right? It's sometimes used for anxiety as well, but usually used for depression. And they were talking about the fact that we have so much information now that it's not just serotonin levels. We used to tell people a long time ago that your serotonin levels are low. And so we're going to give you something that will increase your serotonin levels. And that gets like the happy stuff going. And that now you feel happy, right? Well, the reality is what we found is that serotonin actually helps what's called BDNF. It's a brain growth factor. It basically helps the hippocampus and various parts of your brain start to grow and start to reconnect and start to work the way that it's supposed to. And that's why antidepressant medications sometimes take a few weeks to start working. There are structural changes happening in your brain. Well, guess what we have that works even better as far as increasing BDNF? Physical exercise. Physical exercise, but hard to do when you're depressed. Okay, so let's just be real. You're not even motivated to get up and exercise because you're depressed. And so that's understandable. But I'm just telling you, does physical activity and physical exercise help with our stress levels and with our absolutely, it gets our endorphins going. It gets your brain actually, literally, physically, structurally changing, right? Structurally growing in areas that help with feeling good and feeling better. And hippocampus is really good with, we're talking about memory storage and memory retrieval. Sometimes it's hard to even imagine good times when your hippocampus is depressed and shrunken down and so bogged down with everything that's going on, right? So physical activity actually helps you in some of these areas. It actually boosts your mood, right? So we do know that. So yes, feeling like, you know what, I just need to hit something or move something or just get out there and, some people will go on a run or on a jog, right? Absolutely, absolutely impacts us. Something else that you said, just talking about, this person who's experiencing all this pain. I just want us to remember that pain is a messenger. Pain means something. It's not to be ignored. And that's not to say that his pain was being ignored. It's just simply to say, as adults, we have to remember when we are experiencing pain, it's for a reason. We shouldn't push it off and we shouldn't bottle it down and we shouldn't just ignore it. We are increasing our chances of having serious medical conditions. And I'll say one more thing about that. There's a doctor who often presents at a conference, a symposium that my husband and I would attend each year. It was a symposium on child abuse. And he would say, he's a pediatrician, and he would say, pediatricians are the only real doctors, right? And I tended to agree with him because what he means by that is if we can just get all of the stuff that's going on with a child, by the time they're adults, we will not need nephrologists and oncologists and all of these different adult things that people end up having. Why? Because we've managed to actually address people's trauma and their experiences in childhood. It's not, there's something we have in this field, and we say that it's not what happens, with the trauma. It's not that trauma happens. It's what happens when trauma happens. It's our response. And so that's why I say it's so important. If we're talking about being serious about community and being serious about leaders and leaders in our communities, then we will make space for people's stories. We will make space for the person who's not having a great day when we say, hey, how are you doing? We will make space for actually getting to know the children and knowing that, oh, he's in pain and something's going on here. And perhaps we need to address whatever is going on here. In his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Francis Weller tells the story of having gone and visited a West African tribe, and how he saw this girl with a big scar across her face, and she was just dancing so happily and so freely. And he was wondering, what is it that's gone on in her life that she just seems so carefree? She doesn't seem to care about this scar on her face. And like, I want to know what her story is. And it turned out that her mother, when she was younger, had splashed hot water on her because she was upset with her about something, which I think all of us here will agree that that's abusive, that you don't get upset with your child and splash hot water on them and scar them, right? But not only did she recognize that this was wrong for my mother to do, the village came alongside her, recognized that this was wrong for your mother to do, right? Acknowledge the scar, acknowledge the pain, acknowledge that this is not your fault. And so the trauma didn't even have a chance to settle, right? Because community came alongside her, acknowledged her worth and her value, and recognized that something happened to you that was wrong. What would happen if we start acknowledging that there's something wrong in this situation? If we form a community as we are leading others, right? And recognize something is wrong about this situation, right? When we see a scar and when we see that someone is hurting, right? When we see someone in pain, what would happen and what would shift if we can acknowledge that and come alongside them and recognize maybe even the systemic issues that are going on, that it's not their fault and that they cannot internalize, man, this young lady didn't have to wonder, is it my fault? Am I bad? Am I a bad little kid? Why is this happening to me? No, she didn't have to wonder those things because the village came alongside her and recognized it for her. So I just think that that's something that we can start doing in our communities, right? Recognizing when we see something is wrong in this situation and just acknowledging it, just using language and communicating that can be healing in and of itself.
Goodness, wow. This has been an amazing, amazing conversation. It's one of those conversations that you got to go back and listen again to digest it all. Dr. D, we always ask our guests on our last segment as we wrap up, we call it the off script moment, where we ask our guests just to leave our audience with one last piece of whatever is on your heart that you want to leave with our unscripted family.
Yeah, I think that perhaps what is on my heart right now is just that healing is possible. That healing is possible, and there are so many different avenues to healing. We should never limit ourselves to one thing. So even though I sound like a broken record saying go to therapy, I've also talked about community. I've also talked about leaving space for people to share what it is they're experiencing. I've talked about the kindness of maybe making sure people are ready and have the room to listen to what it is that you have to share, right? So I've talked about a lot of different avenues for healing, and I just want you to know that healing is possible. And I think that that's mostly on my mind because I just saw some notifications today for a post that I had on Facebook, and you wouldn't see it at the top of my feed. It was an old post that somebody had commented on, and I saw that I didn't acknowledge their comment, and so it's starting to pop up notifications on my feed again. But I showed a picture of my father's old home that was in severe disrepair. I mean, the front balcony had fallen off, and the walls were crumbling. Literally, the foundation was crumbled and warped, which I liked that, to be honest, because I knew that some kind of demolition would have to happen before anything got rebuilt there. But I decided that I would go and sow some wildflower seeds there because I wanted something of beauty to grow from that space. And when I went to go sow some wildflower seeds, I saw that someone had demoed most of the house. They rebuilt a house there. They cleared a lot of the land space and left a few of the trees. And so it looks really beautiful as opposed to what I was expecting to go back and see. And for me, it was very healing to see that there is life in a place that nearly killed me. And I think that we have to open ourselves to any option of healing that is available, right? Sowing wildflower seeds in a place that was ugly and trying to bring beauty out of that place. For a long time, one of the things that I tried to do was dig up a plant from there and bring it home. It would always die. And I hated that because I was just like, man, I really want something like living and full of life to come from there. And I had to recognize that I'm living and I'm full of life and I came from there. Right. And so I opened my mind to a different avenue of healing. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't going to a therapy office, at least, right? But it was definitely therapeutic. So open your heart and your mind to any option of healing that is available to you. And just really believe that healing is possible.
Good Lord. Healing is possible. Someone needed to hear that tonight. I needed to hear that tonight. Healing is possible. Connect with Dr. Dee Knight. You can do that several ways. Instagram at Dr. Dee Knight. You can follow her on Twitter at Restoration RPC and on Facebook RPC Events. Dr. D, do you have anything coming up or anything else that you have that our audience can engage and connect with you with?
I am limiting events right now, even though I'm doing a book signing, but it's local this weekend. And so, and if people want to connect with me, I'm at Dr. Dee Knight. So that's the @ DRDEEKNIGHT on all social media. So whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, if someone wants to connect with me, they can find me, or they can go also on my website, drdknight.com. And I am doing this awesome little thing right now. I say it's an awesome little thing because it's fun for me. But I invited people to connect with me there. They can leave their address. They can leave just their contact information. And I am sending out art in the mail. And so please be patient with me. I did not expect over 100 people to sign up for this. I thought that just, like maybe 12 people or so would sign up. And that would be simple. The first 2 sets of artwork has gone out. Just art, encouraging messages. And I want to start sending some encouraging messages once a week to people as well. So something maybe a little longer than a text message, but definitely shorter than an email. So if anyone wants to connect with me that way, please feel free to do so. drdknight.com.
Absolutely. Stay connected with us here on UnScripted. You can follow us on all social media platforms at UnScripted Leadership. Our website, unscripted-leadership.com. You can listen to our podcast literally on all podcast streaming platforms. If you want to continue to help support our mission of developing and empowering leaders in the business, family, and the community areas of their life, you can do so at patreon.com/unscripted leadership. Again, we say thank you to Dr. Dee Knight for having this amazing conversation with us on how to work through trauma to become a better leader. I feel like we need to have her back for part 2, John, because this could have, went longer tonight, but we want to respect the time. And again, thank you, Dr. Dee Knight. Healing is possible. That's gonna be in my spirit all week long. Healing is possible. As always, we pray that you be the leader that God has called you to be. We're here to build bridges and not walls. Bridges connect and walls divide. Until next time, God bless you.